Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I'm here today to do a book haul revisit. If you are unfamiliar, this is where I look back at this month in particular in the past to see how many of the books I brought into my library I have read, how many I would still like to read, how many I have unhauled, and start the process of thinking about if I might be unhauling any of these books in the future. It is my way of making myself a more intentional book purchaser. So obviously we will be looking back at the month of July, since that's the month that it is while I am filming this, and we have 5 years to get through in this book haul revisit. In order to make this video not as long as it would be if I went through everything that I brought into my library, I have come up with a couple of rules to simplify things and narrow the books that are under consideration for book haul revisits. In cases where I was completing an author collection, I don't include them. So I went and got all of the Sue Grafton books. They're on my shelf over there. I got a bunch of Toni Morrison's books to make sure I filled out my collection there. Louise Erdrich is another one. So any case like that, I have removed those books from this list that we will be going through. I also removed anything that was gifted to me or given to me or like sent to me by a publisher because I didn't purchase it for my library. We are kind of intentionally looking at books that I spent money on, intending to read it at some point soon. And that's a very different thing. I've also removed anything that was for my Pulitzer Project. If you are new here, I am doing a Pulitzer Project. I'm reading every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And somewhere along the way, I decided that I wanted to own copies of all of those books. So I purchased them for a project. Again, it's different than me spending money on a book hoping that I would read it soon. It was for another purpose, so it's not being included. And I've also removed anything that I had already read at the time I purchased a copy. So basically, sometimes I get books from the library or I listen to them on audio. If I liked them enough that I want a copy in my library, it's different than, again, spending money on a book with the intention of reading it at some point. So those have all been removed. And I am not going to spend time in this video talking about what these books are about. I will have links to all of the original book hauls down below in the description box. So if you go to those original book hauls, you will find all of the books that I brought into my library in the month, including the ones that don't meet the criteria we're using here. But you'll also get descriptions of what these books are about. In my recent book hauls, I read a little bit from the opening of the book as well. When you go to the ones that are further away, like 5 years ago, I didn't do that yet, but I do it a lot in the more recent ones. I just want to shout out 3 books that I brought into my library in the month of July in past years, but don't meet the criteria. I just kind of want to shout them out because I read them and they are delightful. First is Dearborn by Ghassan Zenedine. I got an advance reader's copy of this from Tin House, so it was sent to me. I didn't spend money on it, but I really enjoyed this book and I would totally recommend it to you. Another one is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, which has a sequel coming out in about a month. And I had already read this one when I purchased a copy. I had listened to it on audio and I just wanted one in my library. So it was purchased for that. And then the final one I want to shout out before we get going is Only This Beautiful Moment by Abdi Nazemian. I listened to this on audio. Those are the 3 that I want to shout out, but don't meet the criteria for this video. Let's get going because as you can see, we have a lot to talk about. And the first pile is not even on that one, but it is small. So when we go back to July of 2023, and I should say we're going to start with my most recent book hauls, and then we'll move backwards in time and go to July of 2019. I believe that is the furthest away book haul. Yes, July of 2019. So there are 3 books that qualified for July of 2023. The first one is Days Without End. I can't remember the timing of the Booker Prize long list last year, but I think the fact that he was on the long list for the Booker Prize last year really got me thinking about reading a Sebastian Barry book, and this was the one that most people had recommended to me. So either I had gotten recommendations for a Sebastian Barry book, and it was a coincidence that he ended up on the Booker long list, or he ended up on the long list, and I sought this book out and found it at my local used bookstore. I have not read it yet, but I would still really like to, and hopefully I will be getting to it at some point soon. Next, we have Ann Tyler's Dinner at the Homesick restaurant. This is something I did end up reading toward the end of last year. It was one of the last books that I read in 2023. I did ultimately listen to it on audio, but I loved this book, and I'm looking forward to reading more of Ann Tyler's books as a result. So Dinner at the Homesick Restaurant was a wild success, even though I did ultimately listen to it on audio. Even then, it is something that I probably would have wanted to have in my library. So even if I didn't have a copy of the book before I listened to it on audio, I probably would have looked for a copy, because I feel like this is a book that I'm going to continue pointing to in the future as something that I have really enjoyed. It was that good. And there we go, a success story, which is good, because I haven't read the third one yet. It's O Pioneers by Willa Cather. Now, just before I started filming, it did occur to me that Willa Cather actually fits that designation of an author whose works I was attempting to complete. So technically, this does not actually qualify for this book haul revisit, but I had already done some math on the percentages of the books that I had read and unhauled, and I don't want to redo the math. I'm not good at math. Please don't make me redo it. So I decided, you know what? It is what it is. It's getting included. So I haven't read O Pioneers yet, but I would really like to. Willa Cather is in the Pulitzer family of authors, and not for O Pioneers. She won for a different book, but I would like to read a lot more of her work. I have only read My Antonia thus far. So eventually, at some point, I will get around to this one. So of the 3 books that qualified for July of 2023, I've only read one. And according to math that I did on Google, that is 33%. And I have not unhauled any of the books yet, which is pretty good. And I don't have plans to unhaul any of those 3 books yet either. So let's move back to July of 2022. I am going to rather carefully move this pile out of the way, because it has some heavy, larger books, and I don't want to create a disaster by knocking everything over. Let's get going on July of 2022. The first book I brought into my library was The New York Stories of Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton is another person who's in the Pulitzer family of authors. I haven't been actively collecting all of her books, but I have already read The Age of Innocence, and I absolutely loved it. And I've read a book, Summer, of hers, and I loved it. I believe it was Kim at Middle of the Book March who read The New York Stories of Edith Wharton and loved it. And as soon as she talked about it, I thought I would really like to find a copy. So I did. I haven't gotten around to reading it yet, but I did not have immediate plans to read it at the time I brought it into my library. It was more of a library builder, which is sort of aspirational reading to me. I love the idea of like having a book for the future. So I didn't have immediate plans to get to it. It's something that I would get to down the road. And hopefully down the road, I will still get to it. Then we have Our Colors by Gengoroh Tagame, translated by Ishii. This is a graphic novel. He wrote a book called My Brother's Husband, Volume 1 and Volume 2, that I loved. And as soon as I realized that another work of his had been translated into English, I ran out and I grabbed it. I did read it. You know, it's a manga, so it was not very difficult to get through. I think I read it in a single afternoon. I didn't like it as much as My Brother's Husband, Volume 1 and Volume 2, but I did enjoy it. And I would look for more work from Gengoroh Tagame, should it be translated into English in the future. Here's a book that I'm not sure if I'm going to keep, because I'm not entirely sure I want to read it anymore. It's My Policeman by Beth Ann Roberts. When I first heard about the existence of this book, I was really excited because there's an E.M. Forster connection and it sounded fascinating. And at the time, there was a movie coming out, I think in about a couple of months or maybe even a year at that point. I think it was just a couple of months at that point. And I ordered a copy from the UK because it was largely unavailable in the US. They needed to reprint it over here. So I ordered a copy from the UK. That's how hyped I was to read this book. But it took such a long time for my copy to arrive since I ordered it from the UK. And I didn't get around to reading it right away. So a lot of people read it toward the end of summer and in the beginning of fall. And the feedback I got on it was pretty terrible. A lot of people disliked this book a great deal. And that pretty quickly killed any sense of urgency I had to read the book. And then the movie came out and also got terrible reviews. So I feel like I'm pretty stuck at this point. I don't know that I actually want to read this anymore, so I'm not sure I need to hold on to it. So if you've read My Policeman by Beth Ann Roberts, let me know what you thought of it. I've already heard from a lot of people who pretty aggressively disliked it. So if you think this would be worth keeping to get to at some point down the road, I admit the urgency is gone. So if I do get to this, it would probably be well into the future. But if you think that I should reconsider, let me know in the comment section down below, because this is definitely a book that's on the bubble. I'm not going to get rid of it like immediately or imminently because I don't need room in this part of the alphabet in my library. But I'm really thinking I don't need to hold on to it. So let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below. Then we have Another Country by James Baldwin. Now, technically, James Baldwin would also be in that Willa Cather school. I'm just realizing as I'm talking. So this is another one that I could have eliminated, but I'm already filming at this point. So I'm really not going to stop and reconsider, but also I'm not going to redo all of the math that I have done. So this will probably be the next James Baldwin book that I read. I have not read it, but I would love to. I would love to continue reading my way through James Baldwin's books, which again is kind of why he technically doesn't meet the criteria for this book haul revisit, because he's an author who I would like to read all of his books and own all of his books. So there it is. But I have not read it yet. I would very much like to. I've heard a lot of really great things. Then I had brought Heartstoppers Volume 2 and Volume 4 into my library. I have read both of these. I read Volume 2 pretty quickly after getting it. I didn't get to Volume 4 until this year. And, funny story, I brought Volume 5 into my library this year, read Volume 5, and then realized I hadn't read Volume 4, so I had to run and get it in. But regardless of my weird klutzy living, I have read both of them. So that's a success story, and they will be staying on my shelf because I think this series is adorable. The final book that I brought into my library in July of 2022 was Under the Whispering Door by T.J. Klune. This was a new book at the time, and I've held off on reading it because this is a book that deals with the afterlife, at least to a degree. And I don't want to get into what the book is about, but that is the thing that has made me hold off on reading it, because in 2022, I lost one of my dogs right around the time or just before this book came into my library. And I definitely wanted to hold off while I was going through the grieving process on that. And then last summer, lost another dog. So it's been a journey. I do still want to read it. Joel actually did read it and really liked it, but I would like to get to it, but I kind of intentionally held off on this book until, I could work my way through some other things. I might be ready to do it now, but I feel like at this point, with the sequel to The House in the Cerulean Sea coming out in about a month, I'll probably do that one first and get to Under the Whispering Door at some point in the future. I would definitely still like to read it. I just think with the sequel coming, that's the weird thing about timing when you don't get to something right away. I feel like I'm going to do that one before I do this one. And it is what it is. So I brought 7 books into my library that qualify for our purposes here in July of 2022. I have read 3. And according to the math that I did online, that is 43%. We're doing good. I don't have any unhauls. And 43% is almost half. So that's something. It's not nothing, at least. And don't worry, we will start getting to unhauls, not in this next book haul revisit, but in the year after this one, because we're moving to July of 2021 at this point, and there are 8 books to talk about in that one. Another trend I've noticed doing book haul revisits is that my book hauls tend to get larger as I go back in time. That's not always the case, but it is frequently the case, and you do definitely see that here. A lot of that has to do with the fact that 2019 was my first full year on BookTube, and I sort of lost my mind a little bit. The excitement about being on BookTube and talking about books made me purchase a lot of books, and you will notice in one of the years that we get to soon, I ended up unhauling almost all of the books. because I was purchasing books without necessarily having any regard for whether or not I wanted to read them or would keep them in my library. And that is something I've been thinking about a lot more as I've been doing book haul revisits. It's kind of the purpose of doing them. But anyway, we're talking about July of 2021 when I brought 8 books into my library. The first of which is After Francesco by Brian Malloy. This was recommended to me by Chelsea from Montana Book Company. I believe that was the first year that the Pride ceremony in Helena, Montana was in the month of July. And this was on their Pride display, and Chelsea told me about it, and I just had to have a copy. Joel has read it and really liked it. But again, this is a book that really deals with grief. So when I didn't get to it in July of 2021, fast forward a year later, I was reeling from grief because I had just lost a dog, and you can see again how this one kind of got away from me. I would still like to read it, and I think I'm about at the point where I can catch up to it and not feel emotionally devastated. I mean, I'm sure it will be emotionally devastating, but, not personally. Maybe it won't affect me as personally, so I would still like to read it. It's not going anywhere. Chelsea also recommended Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian, which is not a graphic novel. I feel like a lot of the time people will comment on the cover and say that it looks like a graphic novel. It is not. It is a young adult novel. I read this and I loved it. And ties back to Only This Beautiful Moment. So when I had heard that Abdi Nazemian had released a new book, I grabbed it. And this is why. Because Like a Love Story made me feel like Abdi Nazemian is an author that I would really like to read more of. So Like a Love Story was a huge success, and I am looking forward to Abdi Nazemian's next book. In fact, I think he has one coming later this year or next year. But anyway, the next one was Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. Joel has read this and loved it. A lot of people I know have read this and loved it. But they say that it's kind of violent and disturbing, and for that reason, I kind of held off because, again, when I didn't get to it in 2021, get to 2022, and stress over sick dogs and then lost dogs made me feel like I don't need that right now. Also stress about politics and the world. So I do feel like I'm ready to read this book. I just need to actually make it happen. So I would definitely still like to read this book, and I have no plans to get rid of it anytime soon, but I haven't yet. Then, while we were in Helena for Pride, a used bookstore just down the street from Montana Book Company was having a sale where you could get 3 hardcover books for $1. And one of the books that I picked up was Like Water for Chocolate by Lara Esquivel. This was a success story. I read it almost immediately after bringing it into my library. So this is one of those rare cases where I brought a book into my library and read it like immediately. And I liked it. So there you go. Success. It's always nice to have success. One of the other books that I picked up there was How Much of These Hills is Gold by C. Pam Zhang. And I have not gotten around to this one. I admit I don't have immediate plans to read it. I didn't have immediate plans to read it when I brought it into my library in July of 2021. But I'd heard a lot of really good things about it, and I figured this would kind of be a library builder, especially since I was getting 3 hardcover books for $1. I'll let you do the math on how much that would make this cost, because I'm not going to do it. But yeah, I will be holding on to this, and maybe if in 2 or 3 years, if I haven't gotten around to it, I might start thinking about unhauling, but I'm not feeling any rush right now. The other one, by the way, was part of my Pulitzer Prize project collecting. It was Angle of Repose. So that is how I got a hardcover copy of that book for my library. So that's what the third book is. It doesn't qualify for our purposes here, but since I had mentioned that there were 3, I didn't want to leave you hanging or wondering what the third book was. The next book that meets our criteria for the book haul revisit was The Man with Night Sweats. This is a poetry collection by Tom Gunn. I had heard about this from Jen the Librarian, and I have not read it yet, which is, kind of a shame because it's not that big. You could dunk this in your coffee. But I would still like to. Joel read it, and I think he liked it. But so I just don't read a lot of poetry. That's the thing. So I should just sit down some Saturday morning with my dog Teddy and a cup of coffee and just read it. Because I would still like to, and it should be pretty easy to do once I actually sit down and do it. It's the sitting down and doing it that is the problem. But it's not going anywhere. That is for sure. That takes us to Gay Bar Why We Went Out by Jeremy Atherton Lynn. I have not read this yet. And actually, I've recently been hearing a lot of good things about this from people who have been catching up to it and reading it over the last year. And that kind of raised my sense of urgency back up, because a lot of the time what will happen is when a book is released, you hear a lot about it and you get really excited to read it. And then as time goes, that urgency flags. So you need something to kind of inspire you sometimes. And the fact that people have been reading this over the last year and liking it has lifted that urgency back up. I would really like to get to it. This is definitely something I would be much more likely to read on audio. I have noticed doing book haul revisits that I'm much more likely to do nonfiction on audio than I am to read it in print. However, this is a case where I probably wouldn't have cared and would have purchased the book anyway, because I also think it's important to support the type of publishing that you would like to see. And nonfiction about queer life is something I would like to see. So I probably would have purchased a copy anyway, but I am more likely to read this on audio. And at some point, I will hopefully be getting around to reading it. The final book that I brought into my library in July of 2021 is There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko Tsumura. This is a translated work. It's translated from the Japanese by Polly Barton. So in 2021, I was working to read a lot more global literature, and this was intended to be part of that. And I didn't get around to reading it. And I admit this is definitely another case where the fact that so much time has passed means that the urgency to read it has flagged a bit. And the size of it has put me off a little bit from picking it up, just because it feels like a big commitment at a certain point. It is about 400 pages, which is really not that bad. It just feels like a large book. So I still want to read it. But I think this is another case where if it's still here and unread in 2 or 3 years, then I'll probably start thinking, all right, am I really likely to ever read this book, or should I just let it go? But for now, it's totally fine staying on my shelf, because I would really like to read it, and I've heard good things about it. So if you've read There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job, let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, because I feel like this is a case where I would need some enthusiasm to work up some inspiration to get reading on that one. Okay, so July 2021, I brought 8 books into my library. I do not have a good track record with July of 2021. Out of those 8 books, I have only read 2, and those are Like a Love Story by Abdi Nazemian and Like Water for Chocolate by Lara Esquivel. That is 25% of that month's book haul, which is not great. It's not great. But I haven't unhauled anything either, and I don't have immediate plans. There are 2 in here that I might get rid of at some point in the future if I haven't read them, but nothing is in danger right now. Let's go back to July of 2020. This is actually a significantly smaller book haul. There are only 4 books that I brought into my library, and I actually only have 2 of them in my hand right now, but one of them has a weird question mark about that. So we'll talk about that one first. So Olivia by Dorothy Strachey was one of the books that I brought into my library in July of 2020. And I had thought about reading this book recently. So I know I had it in my house as recently as a month ago or 2 months ago. At some point in the first half of 2024, I was thinking about books that I might want to read immediately. And Olivia was one of the books that I pulled to think about. So when I went to look for it on my shelf for this book haul revisit, it's not there. So when I pulled it to consider it among a pile of books for whatever my next read would be, somehow it must have not ended up back on my shelf, because I looked around in the immediate area and it's not in the immediate area. I kind of took a quick look through the rest of my shelves and didn't see it. So hopefully it's in my house somewhere. I just can't find it. So I haven't read it yet, but the fact that it was in the mix when I was thinking about things that could be my next read lets you know that it is something I still want to read. Hopefully I can find it. That is going to be the weird sticking point on that one. I'm not counting it as something that I've unhauled, because I'm hoping it's somewhere in the house. I just need to find it. And that is a very unique circumstance for a book haul revisit. The next one that I brought into my library in July of 2020 is The Girl Who Wrote Loneliness by Kyung-Suk Shin. And this is another translated work that doesn't have the name of the translator on the cover. It's translated from the Korean by Ha Yun Jung. I brought this into my library because Kyung-Suk Shin is Matthew Sharapa's favorite author, and at the time I was new to BookTube and getting to know people, and I brought it into my library, and I've actually read 2 Kyung-Suk Shin books at this point, but both of them were books that I don't actually own. I still need to catch up to The Girl Who Wrote Loneliness, so it's not going anywhere. I do still want to read it very much, but I have not read it yet. Then I brought Camp by L.C. Rosen into my library. This is another one I heard of from Jen the Librarian. And I did read this, and it was a delight. I thought it was a fun book. And there was an announcement that it was going to be adapted as a film by Billy Porter. And I haven't heard any updates since. So I hope that does ultimately end up happening. I thought this was a great, fun YA book. And if you haven't read it, maybe think about checking it out. The last book was The Cooking Gene by Michael Twitty. Now, I didn't unhaul this book, but I don't have it. And I am counting it as an unhaul at this point because I think in 2020, I loaned it to a neighbor who wanted to read it and they still have it. So at this point, I'm thinking I'm not going to be getting it back. And it's fine. I think I would be much more likely to read it on audio anyway. But since it's been such a long time that it hasn't been here, I'm counting it as an unhaul. It wasn't a conscious unhaul, but I'm counting it as one for now. And I would actually still like to read it, but I know I would be much more likely to read it on audio anyway. So there it is. So of those 4 books that I brought into my library in July of 2020, I've read 1. And again, that's 25%, which is not great. And there's 1 book that I'm counting as an unhaul, even though, again, it wasn't a conscious unhaul. And that is, again, 25% of the book haul. Now we get to July of 2019. And this is the one where there are a lot of books. There are 8 books, but most of them have been unhauled. The first one is not an unhaul. It's Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown. I did catch up to this book finally. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but I loved this book. I thought it was great. If you have read Fanny Flagg, like Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe, which is faced out on my shelf right there, this has a very similar vibe. And I would recommend it to you. I really, really enjoyed Ruby Fruit Jungle. So we open with a success story, a book that I will always keep in my library and which I did read. The rest of this is going to start getting bleak fast. The next one was An Untamed State by Roxane Gay. And this was one of those months in my first year on BookTube where I just kind of went crazy bringing stuff into my library and had little to no regard about how imminently I might read something, whether or not I really wanted to read something or anything like that. I think the sticking point for An Untamed State is that everyone I know who has read it talks about how brutal it is. And ultimately I just decided, you know what, I really kind of don't want to read that. I don't know that I will ever be in the mood to read that, so I'm just going to let it go. And the same is true for Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison. It's the exact same story. I just started feeling like I was having a resistance to reading it because of how brutal it is. And for that reason, I ultimately decided to unhaul it. Then there was Happiness by Aminata Forna, which was a bit of a BookTube darling at the time, if you went back to July of 2019. I want to say it was a competitor for the BookTube prize at that point. And maybe that's part of why so many people on BookTube were reading it and talking about it at that point. And I just kind of saw it in my local used bookstore and thought, oh, how fun. I can join in the conversation. And then I didn't read it. And then fast forward 2 or 3 years. And I remember seeing it on my shelf and thinking, what is this? And I had to remind myself, oh, right. It's that book that a lot of people were talking about 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm probably not going to ever get around to reading. And there you go. Then there's Three Women by Lisa Taddeo. I thought that sounded like a good book, but right after I brought it into my library, I heard some very negative reviews about it on BookTube, and then I started to read it, and I started seeing all of the things that people had been complaining about, and I thought, you know what? I think I'm just going to put this book down because I think I'm going to get infuriated if I keep reading. So I DNF'd it, and it is no longer here. Then, The Far Field by Madhuri Vijay. I ended up reading that book for the BookTube prize and really didn't like it. So pretty much as soon as I was done with it, I exorcised it from the house like a demon and have never looked back. Then there was The Pervert by Remy Boydell, which was a graphic memoir, and I thought it was just okay, and I knew I was never really going to reread it, so at some point I decided I'm just going to release this and move on with my life. We close with the final success story from this book haul revisit, How We Fight for Our Lives, a memoir by Saeed Jones, which I have read and which I liked. So finally, we loop around to something that I have in my library and did read. So there you go. And of those 8 books that I brought into my library in July of 2019, I read 4.5. I'm counting Three Women by Lisa Taddeo as a 0.5. I can't remember at what point I DNF'd it, but you know, whatever. It's just easy to do 0.5 rather than try to do weird percentages other than that. So 4.5 out of 8 is 56%, according to the math that I did online. And that's more than half, so that part is good. I did a pretty good job actually reading the large amount of books, 8 books that I brought into my library that month. The problem is the unhaul is 6 out of 8, which is a 75%, what's the opposite of a success rate? Failure rate? And that part's not great. Especially since some of the, like Three Women, The Far Field, The Pervert, those were books that I read but didn't really like. So it is what it is. Overall, in these book hauls, I brought 30 books into my library. So in the last 5 Julys, I brought 30 books that qualify for our purposes here into my library. And I have read 11.5. That's 38%. So I could do a little bit better. My goal is to have read about half of them, and I'm pretty far off of that at this point. And, you know, we'll see. There are a lot of books in these book hauls that I would still like to read. It's just a question of when. And of those 30 books, I unhauled 7, a whopping 6 of which were from the one book haul, July of 2019. That's 23% of the overall total of books. And there are some that I might potentially get rid of at some point in the future, but there's nothing that feels like it's going to be out the door immediately. If you have feedback about any of the books that I've talked about here, especially the ones that I haven't read, and you have an idea of which one I might want to prioritize, let me know in the comments section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time. Stay tuned. My book haul for July will be coming pretty soon because I am filming this later in the month than I usually would. But as always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.